A police officer is called to a black neighborhood for a noise complaint when suddenly a little black girl approaches him and asks him a simple question that would change both of their lives forever. The sun was setting over the neighborhood as Officer Jimmy Fletcher pulled his patrol car to the curb. The street was quieter than he'd expected for a noise complaint, but the weight of wary stares from the residents told him everything he needed to know. He stepped out of the car, his boots crunching on the gravel, and scanned the area. A few people were sitting on their porches, eyes locked on him with a mixture of suspicion and unease. He'd been in this situation too many times before. Jimmy took a deep breath, adjusting his belt as he glanced at the report in his hand. Noise complaint, it read, but he knew that was often just code for something else. He walked around the front of the car, his gaze sweeping the street. It was calm, almost too calm. "Excuse me, sir," he called to a man sitting on a porch a few houses down. The man, middle-aged with a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, didn't respond. Jimmy didn't push. He'd learned that forcing interactions only made things worse. Instead, he kept his voice steady and unthreatening. "We got a call about some noise. Is everything okay around here?" The man glanced at him, then back at the small group of kids playing on the sidewalk nearby. "Everything's fine," he muttered, his eyes returning to the children, as if daring Jimmy to challenge him. Jimmy nodded. "All right, just checking." He turned back toward the car, feeling the tension in the air. It was like walking on a tightrope, knowing one wrong move could send everything spiraling out of control. He was about to get back into the car when he heard a small voice behind him. "Mister?" He turned and saw a little girl, no older than 7 or 8, clutching a worn-out teddy bear to her chest. Her wide eyes, dark and uncertain, looked up at him as if searching for something she couldn't quite name. Jimmy squatted down to her level, his expression softening. "Hey there, what's your name?" She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if making sure it was okay to talk. "Tiana," she said finally, her voice barely more than a whisper. "That's a pretty name," Jimmy said gently. "I'm Jimmy." "What's up, Tiana?" The girl fidgeted, her small fingers gripping the teddy bear tighter. Are you gonna hurt me?" The question hit Jimmy like a punch to the gut. For a second, he couldn't find his voice. He blinked, trying to process what he'd just heard. "What?" he managed, his voice strained. "No, of course not. Why would you think that?" Tiana looked down, her toes digging into the dusty ground. "You took my cousin away. My mommy says cops hurt people like us." Jimmy felt a cold wave of realization wash over him. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, a woman's voice cut through the air like a knife. "Tiana, get away from him." Jimmy stood up slowly as a woman hurried over, her face a mask of anger and fear. She pulled Tiana back, putting herself between the girl and Jimmy. "What do you think you're doing?" she snapped, her eyes blazing. Jimmy raised his hands, palms out. "Ma'am, I was just what?" she interrupted, her voice shaking. "Just scaring my daughter? Just reminding her that she's not safe, even on her own street?" Jimmy shook his head. "No, I'm not here to hurt anyone. We got a call about a noise complaint. I was just checking to see if everything was okay." The woman, Angela, he remembered her now from the report on a previous incident, gave a bitter laugh. "Noise complaint? You're really gonna stand there and pretend you're here for that? We know why you're here." "Ma'am, please, I'm just trying to..." "Trying to what?" she shot back. "Trying to make yourself feel better? You think just because you're smiling and talking nice, we'll forget everything you and your kind have done to us?" Jimmy took a step back, struggling to keep his voice calm. "I know things haven't been easy. I just want to help, to make things better." Angela's eyes narrowed. "You want to help? Then leave us alone. Stop treating us like criminals in our own homes." Jimmy felt the eyes of the neighborhood on him, every word she spoke echoing in the silence. He nodded slowly, trying to keep his voice steady. "I hear you, and I'm sorry if we've ever made you feel unsafe." "That's not what I want," Angela scoffed, pulling Tiana closer. "Sorry doesn't change anything. Just go back to whatever station you crawled out of and let us live." Jimmy stood there for a moment, feeling utterly helpless. He knew anything he said now would just make things worse. "Okay," he said finally, his voice low. "If you need anything, I'll be around." Angela didn't respond. She turned, guiding Tiana back toward their house. The little girl glanced back at Jimmy, her eyes still full of questions he couldn't answer. As Jimmy got back into his car and drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling of Tiana's gaze lingering on him. The sound of the engine starting seemed too loud in the quiet street. He drove slowly, his mind racing. The weight of what had just happened hung heavy in the air, a stark reminder of the reality he was facing. He wasn't sure how, but he knew he had to do something. For now, all he could do was keep moving, keep trying. As he turned the corner, the fading sunlight cast long shadows over the neighborhood, shadows he couldn't ignore. Back at the station, Jimmy Fletcher sat at his desk, staring blankly at the paperwork in front of him. The noise of the precinct buzzed around him. Phones ringing, officers chatting, the clatter of keyboards. But it all seemed distant, like he was underwater. All he could think about was Tiana's face. And that one haunting question, "Are you gonna hurt me?" He leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. How had it come to this? He'd joined the force because he believed in protecting people, making things better. But somewhere along the way, something had gone wrong. He wasn't naive. He knew the system had its flaws, had seen firsthand how things could get out of hand, but he'd always told himself he was one of the good guys. So why did that little girl look at him like he was a monster? His thoughts were interrupted by the loud laughter of a group of officers a few desks away. Jimmy glanced over and saw them huddled around a monitor, watching a video. Officer Rick Stevens, a burly man with a booming voice, noticed Jimmy's gaze and waved him over. "Hey Fletcher, you gotta see this," Rick called out, grinning. "Some guy in the neighborhood we patrolled tried to run from us. Didn't get far." Jimmy hesitated, then stood and walked over. On the screen, he saw shaky footage from a body cam. An officer chasing a young black man through an alley. The man tripped and fell, and before he could get up, the officer was on him, roughly pinning him to the ground. "Guy was high as a kite," Rick said, still laughing. "Thought he could outrun a cop." The other officers chuckled, but Jimmy felt a sick twist in his stomach. He remembered that incident. It hadn't been his shift, but he'd heard about it. The guy they caught had been scared, desperate. The way they were laughing now, it was like they didn't see him as a person, just another criminal to be caught. Jimmy cleared his throat, forcing his voice to stay calm. "Yeah, but did you see his face after? He was terrified. That's not something to laugh about." Rick's grin faltered. "Come on, Fletcher. Don't get all soft on me. Guy was resisting. We did what we had to." Jimmy nodded slowly, not wanting to escalate things. "I get that. But maybe we need to think about why they run in the first place. If they see us as the enemy, we're just making things worse." Rick frowned, looking at Jimmy like he'd just said something in a foreign language. "What are you talking about? We're not the enemy. We're keeping order, are we?" Jimmy muttered, almost to himself. "Or are we just making people more afraid?" Rick shook his head, clearly irritated. "Look, if you want to play social worker, go ahead. But I'm not risking my neck trying to be friends with these people. You give them an inch, they take a mile." Jimmy knew there was no point arguing. He'd heard it all before. The same lines, the same justifications. But today, they grated on him more than usual. He gave Rick a tight smile and turned back to his desk. He sat down and stared at the blank incident report in front of him. He knew he should be filling it out, but the words wouldn't come. All he could see was Tiana's eyes, the way she'd clutched that teddy bear like it was a shield against the world. "Are you gonna hurt me?" He sighed and leaned back, closing his eyes. He'd been a cop for nearly 10 years, had seen the good and the bad. He'd watched as officers handled situations with care and respect, and he'd seen others cross lines that should never be crossed. He remembered one of his first partners, a grizzled veteran named Mark, who'd told him, "There's us and there's them, Jimmy. Don't ever forget that." Back then, Jimmy had believed it. He'd kept his distance, done his job, followed orders, but things had changed. He wasn't a rookie anymore, wasn't blind to what was happening around him. He'd seen too many families torn apart, too many kids like Tiana growing up scared of the people who were supposed to protect them. And for what? To keep order? Like Rick said? Whose order? What kind of order made a child afraid to speak to a police officer? Jimmy stood up abruptly, grabbing his jacket. He couldn't sit here any longer, not while his mind was spinning like this. He needed air, needed space to think. As he headed for the door, his sergeant, a stern woman named Jackson, called out to him. "Fletcher, where are you going? You've got reports to finish." "I know, Sarge," he said over his shoulder. "I just need a minute. Make it quick," she said, her tone more concerned than annoyed. "And don't go wandering off. We've got a busy night ahead." Jimmy nodded and pushed through the door, stepping out into the cool evening air. He took a deep breath, letting it out slowly. He looked up at the sky, the first stars just starting to peek through the twilight. For a moment, he just stood there, letting the quiet settle over him. He thought about Angela's face, the way her voice had trembled with anger and fear. He'd tried to tell himself she was just upset, that she didn't really think he was there to hurt them. But the truth was, it didn't matter what he thought. What mattered was what they thought, what they felt. He'd been on this beat long enough to know that trust was fragile, and once it was broken, it was almost impossible to repair. And right now, there was no trust left between the police and the community. They were two sides of a widening chasm, each seeing the other as a threat. "Are you gonna hurt me?" Jimmy rubbed his eyes, feeling the weight of those words. He wanted to say no, to promise that he'd never hurt anyone. But promises were easy. Making them real, that was the hard part. He needed to do something, but he didn't know what. He couldn't change the whole system, couldn't undo the years of mistrust and anger, but maybe, just maybe, he could change one person's mind. Maybe he could show them that not all cops were the enemy. It was a small hope, almost foolish, but it was all he had. Jimmy took another deep breath, squaring his shoulders. He didn't have all the answers, didn't even know where to start. But he knew he couldn't keep doing things the way he had been, not anymore. He turned back toward the station, his steps steady. He had a lot to think about, a lot to figure out. But for now, he'd start with something simple. He'd listen, he'd show up, he'd try. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The church hall was packed, the air thick with a mix of anticipation and unease. Jimmy Fletcher stood at the back, feeling every pair of eyes in the room turn toward him as he entered. Conversations faltered and then faded into silence, leaving only the hum of the overhead lights and the distant rumble of traffic outside. He tugged at his collar, acutely aware of the uniform he was wearing and what it represented to everyone in this room. He spotted Reverend Marcus Green standing near the front, his tall, imposing figure a familiar sight. The Reverend's eyes met Jimmy's, a flicker of surprise crossing his face before it was replaced by a guarded expression. Jimmy had met Green a few times over the years, usually during tense moments when emotions were high and tempers short. Tonight, though, there was something different in the Reverend's gaze, something Jimmy couldn't quite place. He took a deep breath and started walking toward the front, feeling the weight of every step. The rows of chairs were filled with residents, men and women of all ages, kids too, some sitting on their parents' laps or standing near the walls. He recognized a few faces, people he'd seen around the neighborhood during his patrols. They were watching him now, their expressions a mix of suspicion, curiosity, and outright hostility. Reverend Green stepped forward as Jimmy approached, his voice calm but firm. "Officer Fletcher," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "We weren't expecting you tonight." Jimmy nodded, feeling the pressure of dozens of eyes on him. "I know, Reverend. I heard about the meeting and thought I should be here." A murmur went through the crowd, like the rustling of leaves before a storm. Green raised a hand, and the noise subsided. He looked at Jimmy, his dark eyes searching. "Why?" he asked simply. Jimmy swallowed, choosing his words carefully. "Because I want to understand. I want to hear what people have to say. I know there's a lot of anger, and I know we've given you plenty of reasons for it. I'm not here to argue or make excuses. I'm here to listen." The silence that followed was thick and heavy. Jimmy could feel the skepticism radiating from the crowd, the disbelief. He didn't blame them. Why should they believe him? They'd heard promises before, seen people come and go, talking about change that never came. A man near the front stood up, his face tight with barely controlled rage. Jimmy recognized him, Andre Thompson, whose nephew had been arrested last year during a raid that had spiraled out of control. "You want to listen?" Andre's voice was loud and sharp. "What? So you can go back and tell your buddies what a good cop you are? How you tried to make peace with the angry black folks?" There were murmurs of agreement, a few nods. Jimmy held up his hands, palms out, trying to keep his voice steady. "I know it sounds like that, and I'm sorry if it feels that way. I'm not here to pat myself on the back. I need to understand. Because I don't think I've been doing my job right, and that's on me." Andre scoffed, shaking his head. "Doing your job right? What's that supposed to mean? You think just because you show up and say you're sorry, we're all gonna hold hands and sing Kumbaya?" "No," Jimmy said quietly, meeting Andre's gaze. "I don't expect that. I know it's going to take a lot more than words. But I have to start somewhere." The room was still, the tension almost tangible. Reverend Green looked around, then nodded slowly. "All right, Officer Fletcher. You say you're here to listen, so listen." He gestured to the crowd. "Who wants to go first?" For a moment, no one moved. Then, a woman near the back stood up. She was in her late 40s, her face lined with exhaustion. Jimmy recognized her too. Carla Johnson, who worked at the corner store on Elm. He'd stopped in there more times than he could count, but she'd never spoken more than a few polite words to him. "My son was arrested last year," Carla began, her voice shaking. "He was just walking home from work, and they said he fit the description of someone they were looking for. They kept him in a cell for 2 days before they let him go. No apology, no explanation. Just threw him out like he was trash." Jimmy felt a pang of guilt, remembering the incident. He hadn't been involved directly, but he'd heard about it afterward. A mix-up, they'd said, a mistake. But hearing it from Carla's mouth, seeing the pain on her face, it felt like more than that. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I can't imagine what that must have been like for you." For him, Carla's eyes flashed with anger. "You can't imagine?" "No, you can't. Because you don't have to worry about your kid getting picked up for no reason, do you?" Jimmy shook his head, feeling the weight of her words. "No, I don't. But that doesn't make what happened right. It was wrong, and it shouldn't have happened." There were more murmurs, but Carla didn't sit down. Words don't fix anything, officer. We've heard plenty of words. We need to see change. Jimmy nodded, his heart heavy. I know. I wish I could promise that things will change overnight, but I can't. All I can promise is that I'm going to do my part, however I can. The next person to stand was a young man, barely in his 20s, with a scar running down his cheek. Jimmy didn't recognize him, but the look in his eyes was one he knew well, anger mixed with a deep, simmering fear. My brother was tased by a cop 2 years ago, the young man said, his voice flat. They said he was reaching for something, but he wasn't. He was scared, and he ran. They tased him for being scared. Jimmy felt a knot tighten in his chest. I'm so sorry, he said, his voice thick. I can't even begin to. Don't, the young man interrupted, his eyes blazing. Don't you dare say you're sorry. It doesn't mean anything. Jimmy nodded, his throat tight. You're right. It doesn't. I don't know what to say. The young man's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Then don't say anything. Just don't. The silence that followed was heavy, oppressive. Jimmy glanced at Reverend Green, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. He took a deep breath, turning back to the crowd. I know I can't fix what's happened, and I know that saying sorry isn't enough. But I want to do better. I want to be better. I don't know what that looks like yet, but I'm here because I need to understand what you're going through. I need to know how to do this right. There was a long pause. Then a woman's voice, soft but clear, spoke up. You really think you can change things? Jimmy looked over and saw Angela, Tiana's mother, standing near the door. Her arms were crossed, her expression skeptical but not as hostile as before. I don't know, he admitted, but I have to try. Angela's eyes narrowed. Why? Why do you care all of a sudden? Jimmy hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Because I met your daughter, and she was scared of me. And no kid should ever feel that way about someone who's supposed to protect them. I don't want her to grow up thinking that I'm the bad guy. Angela stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, Officer Fletcher, you want to show us you're serious? Prove it. Jimmy nodded, his heart pounding. I will. Reverend Green stepped forward, placing a hand on Jimmy's shoulder. Thank you for coming, officer. It takes courage to stand here and listen, even when you know people are angry. But this is just the beginning. You have a lot of work to do. I know, Jimmy said quietly. I'm ready. The meeting ended soon after, the crowd dispersing slowly, their conversations muted and subdued. As Jimmy left the church, he felt a strange mix of hope and dread. He had taken the first step, but it was just that, a step. There was a long road ahead, full of obstacles he couldn't even begin to see. But as he walked back to his car, the cool night air filling his lungs, he felt a small spark of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Determination. He was going to make things better somehow. He didn't know how yet, but he'd figure it out. For Tiana, for Angela, for everyone who'd been let down by the people meant to protect them. He got into his car and sat there for a moment, staring out at the quiet street. Then, with a deep breath, he started the engine and drove away, his mind already racing with the possibilities of what he could do next. The sun beat down on the neighborhood as Jimmy pulled his patrol car to a stop in front of the old community center. It was Saturday afternoon, and the usually quiet building buzzed with activity. Kids ran in and out, laughter and shouts mixing with the distant thump of a basketball hitting the pavement. A group of teenagers lounged near the steps, watching him warily as he stepped out of the car. He felt a familiar knot of anxiety twist in his stomach. This wasn't a call. He wasn't here because of an incident or a complaint. He was here because he wanted to be, and he knew how that might look to the people around him. He adjusted his belt, took a deep breath, and walked toward the entrance, trying to ignore the eyes on his back. The community center was a big, worn-down building that had seen better days. Faded murals covered the walls, depicting scenes of neighborhood life, families picnicking in the park, kids playing, the skyline of the city in the distance. The paint was peeling in places, and some of the windows had cracks running through them. But there was a sense of warmth and resilience here, a testament to the people who'd kept it going through tough times. As Jimmy walked up the steps, a man in his early 30s stepped forward, blocking his path. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes that seemed to bore right through Jimmy. His stance was casual, but there was a tension in his posture, a readiness that Jimmy didn't miss. What are you doing here, officer? The man asked, his voice steady and calm, but edged with suspicion. Jimmy recognized him. Derek Williams, a local youth mentor and former high school basketball star. He'd heard good things about Derek, how he'd come back to the neighborhood after college to help keep kids out of trouble. But right now, Derek's expression was anything but friendly. Hey, Derek, Jimmy said, keeping his voice even. I'm just here to help out if that's okay. Derek's eyebrows shot up. Help out? He glanced around, as if searching for the hidden cameras. Since when do cops help out around here? Jimmy nodded. understanding the skepticism. I get it. This isn't something you're used to seeing, but I want to change that. I want to be more than just the guy who shows up when something goes wrong. Derek folded his arms across his chest, his gaze never leaving Jimmy's face. You think showing up here today changes anything? Jimmy shook his head. No, not by itself, but it's a start. I know I've got a long way to go, but I'm trying. There was a long pause. Jimmy could feel the weight of the silence, the unspoken history between them, between him, the uniform he wore, and the community that had learned to fear it. Finally, Derek stepped aside, his expression still guarded. All right, Officer Fletcher, but understand this. You're on our turf now. You mess up and you're out. Got it? Got it, Jimmy said, a small, genuine smile breaking through. He nodded his thanks and walked past Derek into the building. Inside, the center was buzzing with energy. Kids were playing basketball in the gym, their sneakers squeaking on the polished floor. In a corner, a group of younger children crowded around a table covered in construction paper, glue, and crayons, working on a messy but colorful collage. Parents and volunteers moved around, chatting and laughing, the atmosphere warm and lively. Jimmy took a deep breath, feeling a little out of place but determined to push through it. He walked over to the table where a few volunteers were setting up trays of food, hot dogs, chips, and cold drinks, all laid out in neat rows. A middle-aged woman with short, curly hair looked up as he approached. She wore a bright yellow t-shirt that read, Community Day Volunteer, and a skeptical expression that matched Derek's. Can I help with anything? Jimmy asked, trying to sound casual. The woman eyed him for a moment, then shrugged. You know how to serve hot dogs? Jimmy chuckled. I think I can manage that. She handed him a pair of tongs and pointed to the trays. All right, officer, let's see what you've got. Jimmy rolled up his sleeves and got to work, falling into a rhythm as he served the food to the steady stream of kids and parents lining up. He made small talk where he could, trying to get a feel for the people around him. Most of them were cautious, keeping their distance, but a few offered tentative smiles or a nod of acknowledgement. As the line dwindled, Jimmy spotted a familiar face, Angela Roberts, Tiana's mother, standing a few feet away with her arms crossed. She was watching him, her expression unreadable. He finished serving the last hot dog and wiped his hands on a napkin, then walked over to her, unsure of what to say. Hey, Angela, he started, his voice a little awkward. I didn't know you'd be here. She raised an eyebrow. I volunteer here most weekends. You? Jimmy shrugged. Just thought I'd stop by, see if I could help out. Angela studied him for a long moment, then shook her head, a hint of a smile playing at the corner of her mouth. You're really serious about this, aren't you? I am, Jimmy said earnestly. I know it's going to take time, but I want to be part of the community, not just some outsider looking in. Angela glanced around, then back at him. People are watching you, you know. They're waiting for you to mess up. I know, Jimmy said quietly, but I'm not going to. She nodded slowly. All right, Officer Fletcher, let's see if you mean it. They stood there for a moment, the noise of the center bustling around them, and then Angela turned and walked over to help with the kids at the art table. Jimmy watched her go, feeling a strange mix of relief and determination. It wasn't much, but it felt like a small step in the right direction. He spent the rest of the afternoon moving between different activities, helping set up the games outside, handing out drinks, even shooting a few hoops with the older kids in the gym. It was awkward at first, but as the hours passed, he felt some of the tension ease. He wasn't just a cop here, wasn't just the uniform. He was Jimmy, a guy who was trying to help out, trying to do something good. As the sun dipped lower in the sky and the crowd began to thin, he found himself standing near the basketball court, watching a group of teenagers playing a pickup game. One of the boys, a lanky kid with a serious face, missed a shot and cursed under his breath. He looked over at Jimmy, his eyes challenging. Think you can do better, officer? Jimmy smiled, recognizing the boy, Jaden, one of Derek's regulars. A good kid with a lot of potential but a chip on his shoulder the size of a boulder. I don't know, Jimmy said, picking up the ball and dribbling it slowly. Maybe. You want to find out? Jaden's friends laughed, but there was no malice in it, just the easy camaraderie of kids enjoying themselves. Jaden shrugged, a faint smirk on his lips. All right, old man, let's see what you've got. Jimmy joined the game, feeling the sweat start to bead on his forehead as he ran up and down the court. He was rusty. He hadn't played seriously in years, but he held his own, sinking a few shots and passing the ball whenever he got the chance. The kids were good, fast, and agile, and he found himself laughing, the sound surprising him with its genuineness. After a few minutes, Jaden stole the ball and took off down the court, leaping into the air and slamming it into the basket with a loud, triumphant whoop. His friends cheered, and Jimmy found himself grinning, breathless and exhilarated. Jaden jogged back over, still breathing hard, and offered Jimmy a fist bump. Not bad, officer, For an old guy, Jimmy laughed, bumping his fist back. Not bad yourself. You've got some serious skills. Jaden's grin faded slightly, his eyes searching Jimmy's face. You really gonna keep coming around here? Or is this just a one-time thing? Jimmy met his gaze, his voice steady. I'm coming back. As long as you all will have me. Jaden nodded slowly, then turned and jogged back to his friends. Jimmy watched him go, feeling a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time, hope. As the sky darkened and the last few families drifted out of the center, Jimmy helped clean up, stacking chairs and picking up trash. Derek appeared beside him, grabbing a few chairs and carrying them over to the wall. You did good today, Derek said, his tone grudging but sincere. People noticed. Thanks, Jimmy said, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. I'm just trying to show I'm serious. Derek nodded, setting the chairs down with a thump. It's a start, but don't think one day's gonna change everything. You've got a lot to prove. I know, Jimmy said quietly. But I'm in this for the long haul. Derek looked at him for a long moment, then nodded again, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. All right, Officer Fletcher. We'll see. They finished cleaning up in companionable silence, and as Jimmy walked back to his car, he felt a strange, unfamiliar lightness in his chest. It wasn't much, but today had felt different. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. Like maybe, just maybe, he could make a difference. As he drove away from the center, the sun setting in the distance, he couldn't help but smile. It was a small victory, but it was a victory all the same. And it was only the beginning. It was early evening, the sun just beginning to dip below the rooftops, casting long shadows across the street. Jimmy was patrolling his usual route when the call came through on the radio. A domestic dispute in progress at an apartment complex a few blocks away. He felt a familiar surge of adrenaline as he flipped on his lights and siren, his heart pounding a steady rhythm in his chest. Domestic calls were unpredictable, often explosive, and this neighborhood had seen too many escalate into something far worse. As he pulled up to the building, he saw a small crowd gathered outside, their faces tense and worried. The front door of the apartment complex was propped open, and from inside, he could hear the muffled sounds of shouting. A man's voice, angry and desperate, followed by a woman's pleading cries. Jimmy took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, his eyes scanning the faces in the crowd. A few of them nodded at him, recognition flickering in their eyes. He'd spent the last few weeks trying to build trust here, and he hoped it was enough to help him now. He approached a middle-aged woman standing near the entrance, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. What's going on? He asked gently, his voice low. It's Ray and Shonda, she said, her voice trembling. They've been arguing all day, but now, I think it's worse. I heard something break and then she screamed. I don't know what he's doing in there, but it sounds bad. Jimmy nodded, his mind racing. He knew Ray, Raymond Jenkins, a guy who'd been struggling to get his life back on track after a stint in prison. Jimmy had talked to him a few times at the community center, had even shot a few hoops with him one afternoon. Ray had seemed like he was trying, but there was always a tension in him, a barely controlled anger that simmered just beneath the surface. Okay, I'm going to go in and see if I can calm things down, Jimmy said. He turned to the crowd, raising his voice just enough to be heard. Everyone, please stay back. I'll handle this. He stepped into the building, his senses on high alert. The shouts were clearer now, echoing off the walls of the narrow hallway. He made his way up the stairs, pausing outside the apartment door where the noise was loudest. He could hear Ray's voice, harsh and angry, punctuated by the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. Jimmy took another deep breath, then knocked on the door, hard enough to be heard over the shouting. Ray, it's Jimmy Fletcher. I'm coming in, all right? There was a sudden, tense silence, and then the door jerked open, revealing Ray's tall, muscular frame. His eyes were wild, his chest heaving with ragged breaths. Behind him, Jimmy could see Shonda, her face pale and streaked with tears. She was clutching her arm, and there was a fresh bruise forming on her cheek. Ray, I just want to talk, Jimmy said, keeping his voice calm and steady. He held his hands out to his sides, showing he wasn't reaching for his weapon. I'm not here to arrest you or anything like that. I just want to make sure everyone's okay. Ray's eyes darted around, as if he were looking for an escape. There's nothing to talk about, man. Just leave us alone. I can't do that, Ray, Jimmy said softly. I'm here because people are worried about you. I'm worried about you. We've talked before, remember? I know you're trying to do the right thing. Ray's jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides. She wouldn't stop nagging, you know? Wouldn't leave me alone. I didn't mean to hurt her. Jimmy nodded, his heart aching at the desperation in Ray's voice. I know you didn't, Ray, but you're upset, and she's scared. Let's just take a minute and breathe, okay? We can figure this out. Shonda made a small, choked sound, and Ray flinched, looking back at her with a pained expression. I'm sorry, baby, he said, his voice breaking. I didn't mean it. Jimmy took a cautious step forward, still holding his hands out. Ray, why don't we step outside for a minute, just you and me? We can talk away from all this. Let Shonda get some space. Ray hesitated, his eyes darting between Jimmy and Shonda. For a moment, Jimmy thought he was going to refuse, but then he gave a slow, reluctant nod. Yeah, okay. Just don't call anyone else, all right? I don't want any trouble. No trouble, I promise, Jimmy said, relief flooding through him. Let's just step outside and talk. Ray turned and walked out of the apartment, Jimmy following close behind. He could feel the tension radiating off Ray's body, every muscle coiled tight. As they reached the stairwell, Jimmy spoke again, keeping his voice low and calm. You've been doing good, Ray, he said. I've seen it. You've been working hard, staying out of trouble. This doesn't have to change that. Ray let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Yeah, right. One slip up and it's all over. You know that better than anyone, don't you? Jimmy winced, knowing Ray wasn't wrong. It doesn't have to be that way. You made a mistake, but you can fix it. You just have to be willing to take that first step. Ray stopped at the bottom of the stairs, his shoulders slumping. I don't know, man. I'm so tired. Tired of fighting. Tired of trying and never getting anywhere. Jimmy reached out, placing a hand on Ray's shoulder. I get it. I really do. But giving up now isn't the answer. You've got people who care about you, who want to see you succeed. Don't throw that away. Ray looked up at him, his eyes filled with a raw, aching vulnerability that made Jimmy's heart clench. I just want things to be different, you know. I want to be better. You can be, Jimmy said firmly. But you have to make the choice. Right now, go back up there. Apologize to Shonda and let her know you're going to get help. We can figure this out, but you have to take that step. Ray swallowed hard, then nodded slowly. Okay, I'll try. Jimmy gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze. That's all anyone can ask, Ray. Just keep trying. They turned and walked back up the stairs together, the tension between them easing just a little. When they reached the apartment, Shonda was standing in the doorway, her face a mask of anxiety and fear. Ray stopped a few feet away, his hands trembling. Shonda, he said, his voice hoarse. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you. I'll get help. I promise. Just, please don't give up on me. Shonda's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, she just stood there, staring at him. Then slowly she nodded. I don't want to give up, Ray, but you've got to get help. I can't keep doing this. I will, Ray said, his voice breaking. I swear. Jimmy stepped back, giving them space. He could feel the eyes of the neighbors on him from the hallway, the tension in the air still thick but beginning to ease. He glanced down the stairs and saw a few familiar faces peeking up, watching intently. As Ray and Shonda talked quietly, Jimmy turned and walked back down to the entrance. He stepped outside, the cool evening air washing over him, and let out a long, shaky breath. The crowd that had gathered was still there, a few people murmuring among themselves. A woman near the front stepped forward, her expression wary. Is everything okay? Jimmy nodded. Yeah, they're talking it out. I think it's going to be okay. The woman's shoulders sagged with relief, and there were a few quiet sighs from the crowd. They began to disperse slowly, people heading back to their apartments, the tension gradually dissipating. Jimmy stayed there for a while, leaning against his car, watching as the last few people drifted away. He felt a strange, conflicting mix of emotions, relief that the situation hadn't escalated, pride that Ray had chosen to take a step toward getting help, but also a lingering worry about what would happen next. He knew this wasn't the end of the story. Ray still had a long road ahead of him, and there would be other crises, other moments when everything could fall apart. But for now, things were calm. For now, they'd made it through. As Jimmy finally got back into his car and drove away, he couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but maybe this was what change looked like. A series of small, hard-won victories, one step at a time. And he'd be there, every step of the way, doing what he could to help. It was the least he could do. Jimmy Fletcher walked into the precinct the next morning feeling a cautious sense of accomplishment. The situation with Ray and Shonda had been a close call, but he'd managed to defuse it without anyone getting hurt. It felt like progress, even if it was just a small step. But as he made his way to his desk, he noticed a few sideways glances from his fellow officers and a stony silence that seemed heavier than usual. Sergeant Jackson, her face tight and unreadable, was waiting for him near his desk. Fletcher, Captain Mitchell wants to see you. Now, Jimmy felt his stomach drop. He nodded, setting his things down. What's this about? Jackson's eyes softened, just a little. You know what it's about. Jimmy let out a slow breath, his mind already racing. All right, I'll head over. The walk to Captain Mitchell's office felt longer than usual. The captain was known for running a tight ship, and while he wasn't exactly a tyrant, He had little patience for officers who didn't follow the rule book. Jimmy knocked on the door and waited, hearing the muffled sound of voices inside. After a moment, Mitchell's voice called out, "Come in!" Jimmy stepped inside, his eyes immediately locking onto Captain Mitchell, who was seated behind his desk, his expression grim. Mitchell was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s, his uniform immaculate, his demeanor all business. He didn't look up right away, his attention focused on the papers spread out in front of him. "Close the door, Fletcher," Mitchell said, his tone clipped. Jimmy did as he was told, feeling the tension coil tighter in his chest. He stood there, waiting, until Mitchell finally looked up, his eyes cold and assessing. "You know why you're here?" Mitchell asked, his voice flat. "I've got an idea," Jimmy replied evenly. He wasn't going to start this conversation by lying. Mitchell leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. "I heard about what happened last night. The call at the Jenkins apartment." Jimmy nodded, keeping his posture relaxed, even though his heart was pounding. "Yes, sir. I responded to a domestic dispute and managed to de-escalate it without any arrests." Mitchell's eyes narrowed. "That's not how it's being reported. I've got a complaint here from one of the neighbors saying you refused to call for backup, that you ignored department protocol and put yourself and others at risk." Jimmy clenched his jaw, anger flaring inside him. "I had the situation under control. I knew Ray, and I knew he wasn't a threat to anyone else. Calling for backup would have escalated things." "That's not your call to make," Mitchell snapped, his voice sharp. "You're not a social worker, Fletcher. You're a police officer. We have procedures for a reason." Jimmy took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "With all due respect, sir, those procedures don't always work in situations like this. I've been spending time in that community, getting to know people, building trust. That's what kept things from getting worse last night." Mitchell's expression hardened. "And what happens next time, huh? You think you can just waltz into every volatile situation and talk people down because they know your name? You're gambling with your life, and for what? To play hero?" "I'm not trying to be a hero," Jimmy said, his voice steady. "I'm trying to do my job, to protect and serve. And sometimes that means not going and blazing, but listening, connecting with people." Mitchell shook his head, leaning forward, his hands resting on the desk. "Your job is to enforce the law, not to play therapist. I can't have officers out there making up their own rules because they think they know better." Jimmy felt a surge of frustration, but he kept his voice level. "Sir, I'm not making up my own rules. I'm adapting to the situation in front of me. That's what we're supposed to do, use our judgment." "Your judgment?" Mitchell scoffed, his eyes flashing with irritation. "You're out there making the department look weak, like we're bending over backward to accommodate people who don't respect us." "That's not what this is about," Jimmy snapped, his control slipping. "This is about doing what's right, not just what's easy. You think the community's going to respect us if all they see is us coming in and cracking heads every time something goes wrong?" Mitchell's face darkened. "Watch your tone, Fletcher. I don't need a lecture on community relations from you." Jimmy took a step back, his heart still racing, but he forced himself to take a deep breath. "I'm sorry, sir. I'm trying to find a way to make this work, for everyone." Mitchell was silent for a long moment, his gaze steady and unyielding. When he spoke again, his voice was low and firm. "I don't care what you think is right. I care about what works and what keeps my officers safe. You ignored protocol, and you're damn lucky no one got hurt. But this is your last warning. If you pull a stunt like that again, I'll have no choice but to take disciplinary action. Do I make myself clear?" Jimmy swallowed hard, nodding. "Yes, sir," Mitchell nodded curtly. "Good. Now get back to work." Jimmy turned and left the office, his mind buzzing with a mix of anger and frustration. He knew Mitchell had a point, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the captain was missing something crucial, that there was more to policing than just following rules and enforcing laws. He'd seen firsthand what happened when the police and the community were at odds, when there was no trust, no understanding, and he couldn't go back to being the kind of cop who just did what he was told, without thinking about the consequences. He made his way back to his desk, the stares from his fellow officers still lingering. He could feel their judgment, their doubt. To them, he was the guy who was trying to play it soft, the one who didn't want to get his hands dirty. He could almost hear the whispers. What's Fletcher doing? Hanging out with those people? Trying to be a hero? A savior? Jimmy sat down heavily, running a hand through his hair. He felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. But it wasn't just physical. It was the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from knowing you were fighting a battle on two fronts, against a community that didn't trust you, and a department that didn't understand you. He glanced around, catching the eye of Officer Rick Stevens, who was watching him from across the room. Rick smirked, shaking his head. "Guess you got chewed out, huh, Fletcher?" Rick said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Maybe next time you'll remember whose side you're on." Jimmy felt a flash of anger but forced himself to smile tightly. I'm on the side of keeping people safe, Rick. That includes everyone, not just us. Rick's smirk faded, his eyes narrowing. You keep thinking that. See where it gets you. Jimmy didn't respond, turning back to his desk. He knew he couldn't expect his colleagues to understand what he was trying to do. For them, it was simple. Us versus them. But Jimmy had seen too much, knew too much to buy into that anymore. He picked up a stack of reports, his hands steady, even though his mind was racing. Mitchell's words echoed in his head, a grim reminder that his path wasn't going to be easy. He was pushing against something bigger than just one person's opinion. He was challenging a whole system, a way of thinking that had been entrenched for years. But he couldn't stop. Not now. Not after seeing the fear in Tiana's eyes, the desperation in Ray's voice. Not after hearing the stories at the community meeting. Feeling the raw, painful truths that people had shared. He had to keep going, had to keep trying to bridge that gap, no matter how hard it was. He looked up, his gaze sweeping over the busy precinct. He knew he was standing on shaky ground, knew that one wrong move could send everything crashing down. But he also knew he couldn't go back to the way things were, not anymore. Taking a deep breath, Jimmy turned his focus back to the reports in front of him. He'd figure it out one way or another, because he had to, because he believed deep down that things could be better, that he could make them better. And no matter what Captain Mitchell or anyone else thought, he wasn't going to stop until he did. The sun was setting over the neighborhood as Jimmy Fletcher pulled his car to the curb outside Reverend Green's church. The sky was a brilliant canvas of purples and pinks, but Jimmy barely noticed. His thoughts were too tangled with the events of the past few days. The confrontation with Captain Mitchell, the quiet hostility from his fellow officers, and the nagging feeling that he was trying to push a boulder uphill. He stepped out of the car and took a deep breath, letting the cool evening air calm his nerves. The church doors were open, a soft glow spilling out onto the steps. He could hear voices inside, a low murmur of conversation that grew louder as he approached. He wasn't sure what to expect tonight. Reverend Green had called him personally, inviting him to a community meeting. There'd been something in the Reverend's voice, a seriousness that had put Jimmy on edge. He walked up the steps and hesitated at the entrance, peering inside. The hall was packed, more people than he'd seen at any of the previous meetings. There were familiar faces, Angela, Derek, Carla from the corner store, but also a lot of new ones. People he didn't know, all watching him as he stepped through the door. Reverend Green spotted him and raised a hand in greeting. Officer Fletcher, glad you could make it. Jimmy nodded, trying to read the mood of the crowd. There was an energy here, something buzzing just below the surface, and he couldn't tell if it was anger, hope, or something in between. Thanks for inviting me, Reverend. What's going on? Green's eyes were serious, his expression thoughtful. We've been talking, the community and I. People have been noticing the work you've been doing, the changes you're trying to make. They want to support you, but they're also worried about what it means for you, for all of us. Jimmy's stomach tightened. He'd known this would happen eventually, that his efforts to change things would draw attention, not all of it positive, but he hadn't expected it to come to a head like this. I appreciate that, he said carefully. I'm just trying to do my part, make things better. I know it's not going to be easy, but easy's never been the point, a voice called out from the crowd. It was Derek, standing near the back, his arms crossed. We know it's not easy, but that doesn't mean we stop trying. There were murmurs of agreement, and Jimmy felt a flicker of relief. He knew he had allies here, people who believed in what he was doing, but he also knew that belief wasn't enough to keep things from falling apart. Look, I know you're all putting a lot of faith in me, he said, his voice steady, but this isn't about just one person. We all need to be in this together, or it's not going to work. We know that, Angela said, stepping forward. She looked different tonight, more determined, almost defiant. But the thing is, we've seen too many people come and go, too many promises made and broken. We need to know that you're in this for the long haul, not just until things get tough. Jimmy nodded, feeling the weight of her words. I am. I'm not going anywhere, but I can't do this alone. I need your help, your support. Reverend Green cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention back to him. That's what tonight is about. We're here to show you that we're behind you, Officer Fletcher. But we also need to talk about what happens next. What do you mean? Jimmy asked, his heart pounding a little faster. Green gestured to the crowd, his voice steady. People have been talking, sharing stories about the things you've done, the ways you've tried to help. We've put together a petition, asking the department to recognize your efforts and support the changes you're making. We've got over 200 signatures. There was a murmur of agreement, and someone held up a stack of papers, thick with names and scrawled signatures. Jimmy stared at it, a mix of emotions swirling in his chest, gratitude, surprise, and a deep, almost painful sense of responsibility. Wow, he said softly. I don't know what to say. Thank you. This means a lot. It's not just about you, Carla said, her voice strong and clear. This is about all of us. We're tired of living in fear, tired of feeling like we're on our own. We want things to change, and we think you're the one who can help make that happen. Jimmy felt a lump form in his throat. He looked around the room, at the faces watching him with hope and expectation, and felt a surge of determination. He couldn't let them down. Not now. I'm going to do everything I can, he said, his voice steady. I promise you that. A cheer went up from the crowd, and Jimmy felt a swell of pride. But it was tempered by the knowledge that this was just the beginning. There was so much work to be done, so many battles to fight, and he wasn't naive enough to think that a petition would change everything overnight. As the noise died down, Reverend Green stepped forward again, his expression serious. There's something else we need to talk about, Officer Fletcher. We've heard that you've been getting some pushback from your department. Is that true? Jimmy hesitated, then nodded slowly. Yeah. Captain Mitchell isn't happy with the way I'm handling things. He thinks I'm not following protocol, that I'm making the department look weak. There were angry murmurs from the crowd, and Jimmy held up a hand, trying to calm them. I'm not saying this to make you worry. I'm not backing down, but I need you all to understand that this isn't going to be easy. There are people in the department who don't want to see things change, and they're going to push back, hard. We know that, Angela said, her voice steady, but we're not backing down either. We've lived with fear and injustice for too long. If they want to push, we'll push back. Jimmy felt a surge of emotion, pride, gratitude, and something deeper, something almost overwhelming. He knew he wasn't alone in this, but hearing it, seeing it, made it all the more real. Thank you, he said again, his voice thick. Thank you all. Reverend Green nodded, his expression grave. We're with you, Officer Fletcher, but we need to be smart about this. We need to be united, and we need to be prepared. They're not going to make this easy for you or for us. I know, Jimmy said quietly. I'm ready. There was a moment of silence, the air heavy with the weight of what was unspoken. Then, slowly, people began to move forward, offering their support, their encouragement. Jimmy shook hands, listened to their stories, felt their belief in him like a physical force. As the crowd began to thin, he found himself standing alone with Angela near the front of the hall. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. You really think you can do this? She asked, her voice soft but intense. Jimmy hesitated, then nodded. I don't know, but I have to try. Angela's lips twitched in a small, almost reluctant smile. All right, then we'll try too. She held out her hand, and Jimmy took it, feeling a surge of determination. They stood there for a moment, the air between them charged with something like hope. Thank you, he said again, his voice quiet but sincere. Angela nodded, squeezing his hand. Don't thank us yet. We've got a long way to go. Jimmy nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle deep in his chest. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. He felt something else, a spark, a flicker of light in the darkness. He looked around the hall, at the people who had come out tonight, at the faces that were starting to look at him with something like trust. And he knew, no matter how hard it got, no matter how much pushback he faced, he wasn't going to give up. He couldn't. As he walked out of the church and into the cool night air, the petition tucked under his arm, he felt a new resolve take hold. This was his community now, his responsibility, and he was going to fight for it, no matter what it took, because they believed in him, and he wasn't going to let them down. The tension in the air was almost palpable as Jimmy Fletcher walked into the precinct the next morning. The usual bustle of officers, the hum of conversation, the ringing of phones, all seemed muted, like a storm waiting to break. He could feel the stares following him, the murmurs that stopped when he drew near. His heart was heavy with the weight of what he had to do, but he kept his face calm, his stride steady. He knew today would be different. After the community meeting, word had spread about the petition, about the support he was getting from the neighborhood. It wasn't just a petition asking for recognition of his efforts. It was a statement, a demand for change. And that kind of pressure didn't sit well with everyone, especially not in a department that prided itself on doing things the right way, the way things had always been done. Jimmy headed straight for Captain Mitchell's office. He knew he had to face this head-on to show that he wasn't going to back down. He knocked on the door, his knuckles rapping sharply against the wood, and waited. Come in, Mitchell's voice barked from the other side. Jimmy stepped inside, closing the door behind him. Mitchell was at his desk, flipping through a stack of papers with a scowl etched deep into his face. He looked up as Jimmy entered, his eyes cold and hard. Fletcher, Mitchell said, his voice clipped. I've been expecting you. Jimmy nodded, his heart thumping in his chest. Yes, sir. I wanted to talk to you about the community meeting last night. I'm well aware of what happened, Mitchell snapped, tossing the papers onto his desk. 200 signatures demanding that the department support your efforts. You know what that looks like? Jimmy took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. It looks like people are finally seeing that we're trying to make things better, sir. No, Mitchell said, his voice icy. It looks like the department can't control its own officers. Like we're bending over backward to appease a bunch of troublemakers who want to run things their way. Jimmy felt his temper flare, but he held it back. With all due respect, sir, they're not troublemakers. They're people who've been let down by us, time and time again. They're asking for a chance to trust us again, to see that we're here to help, not hurt. Mitchell's eyes narrowed. And you think you're the one to fix that? You think you can just waltz in, make a few friends, and suddenly everything's fine? I don't think it's that simple, Jimmy said, his voice steady. But I do think we can start building something better, something real. And that means changing the way we do things. Mitchell leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. What you're doing, Fletcher, is undermining this department. You're making us look weak, like we can be pushed around. That petition? It's a slap in the face to every officer who's put their life on the line to keep this city safe. Jimmy shook his head, frustration simmering just below the surface. It's not about being weak. It's about being smart, being compassionate. We can't keep treating these people like enemies and expect them to respect us. Mitchell's face twisted into a sneer. You're talking like one of those politicians, Fletcher. All this talk about compassion and understanding. You think that's going to save you when things go south? It's not about saving myself, Jimmy shot back, his voice rising despite himself. It's about saving lives. It's about making sure people like Tiana don't grow up afraid of us, don't see us as the enemy. Mitchell slammed his hand down on the desk, the sound booming in the small office. This is your last warning, Fletcher. I'm done with this touchy-feely crap. You either get back in line, follow orders, and do your job, or I'll make sure you're off the force, permanently. Jimmy stared at him, his heart pounding, his mind racing. He knew this was the moment, the line he had to cross. If he backed down now, everything he'd worked for, everything he believed in, would be for nothing. But if he stood firm, he took a deep breath, letting it out slowly. I can't do that, sir. I can't go back to the way things were. I've seen too much, and I know too much. I'm not asking to break the rules or put anyone at risk. I'm asking for the chance to do this job the way it should be done. Mitchell's eyes were like ice, his jaw clenched tight. Then you're done here, Fletcher. You're suspended, effective immediately. Turn in your badge and your weapon. I'll have the paperwork processed by the end of the day. Jimmy felt a cold, hollow ache in his chest, but he forced himself to nod. If that's what you have to do, sir, Mitchell snorted, a sound of disgust. Get out of my office. Jimmy turned and walked out, his heart heavy, his steps leaden. The precinct seemed to blur around him as he made his way to his desk. He felt eyes on him, whispers following him like ghosts. He reached his desk, his hands trembling slightly as he unhooked his badge and set it down. It felt like an amputation, like he was cutting away a piece of himself. He'd been a cop for so long, had dedicated his life to this job, to this community. And now, he took out his weapon, placed it gently beside the badge, and stood there for a moment, just staring at them. It felt surreal, like he was watching someone else's life fall apart. Fletcher, a voice said softly. He looked up and saw Sergeant Jackson standing a few feet away, her face pale and drawn. She glanced at the badge, then back at him, her eyes filled with something like sympathy. I heard what happened, she said quietly. I'm sorry. This isn't right. Jimmy forced a smile, though it felt more like a grimace. Thanks, Sarge. But I knew this was a possibility. I'm not sorry for what I did. She nodded slowly, her gaze steady. You did good, Fletcher. Don't let anyone make you feel like you didn't. Jimmy nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. I won't. He grabbed his things, just a few personal items from his desk, and turned to leave. As he walked toward the door, the room seemed to part around him, officers stepping back, their faces a mix of confusion, disapproval, and something that looked almost like respect. He stepped outside into the bright morning sun, the cool air hitting his face like a slap. For a moment he just stood there, his mind blank, his body numb. He felt hollow, like a shell, the reality of what had just happened still sinking in. But then, slowly, he felt something else, a spark of determination, a stubborn resolve. He wasn't done, not by a long shot. They could take his badge, his job, but they couldn't take his purpose. He'd made a promise, to himself and to the people who believed in him, and he wasn't going to break it. He pulled out his phone and dialed Reverend Green's number. The phone rang twice before the Reverend's deep, steady voice answered. Jimmy, I was just about to call you. Jimmy took a deep breath. They suspended me, Reverend. I'm off the force. There was a pause. Then Green's voice, calm and resolute. I'm sorry to hear that, Jimmy, but we're not done. This isn't over. Jimmy nodded, even though Green couldn't see it. I know. What's our next move? We're organizing a rally, a show of support for you and for the changes we want to see. The community is behind you, Jimmy. We're not going to let them shut this down. Jimmy felt a surge of emotion, a swell of gratitude and hope. Thank you, Reverend. I don't know what to say. Just be there, Jimmy. Stand with us. That's all we ask. I will, Jimmy said quietly. I'll be there. He hung up, his heart racing, his mind buzzing with possibilities. He wasn't done fighting. Not by a long shot. He had the community behind him, people who believed in him, who wanted to see things change, and he was going to make sure that happened, no matter what it took. As he walked away from the precinct, his steps growing steadier, his resolve hardening, he knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. He'd fight for this community, for the people who trusted him, with everything he had, because he had to, because it was the right thing to do, because he wasn't just a cop, wasn't just a badge. He was Jimmy Fletcher, and he was going to make a difference, no matter what. Jimmy stood on the steps of the community center, looking out over the growing crowd. It was a cold gray afternoon, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain, but people were still coming. Residents from all over the neighborhood, holding signs, talking quietly among themselves. The energy was tense, but determined. Jimmy could feel it in the air, a kind of quiet defiance that made his heart beat a little faster. He glanced over at Reverend Green, who was standing beside him, a calm presence amid the uncertainty. You think this is going to make a difference? Jimmy asked, his voice low. Green turned to him, his eyes steady. It already has. People are here, Jimmy. They're standing up because they believe in what you're doing. That's no small thing. Jimmy nodded, but the doubt lingered. It had been a whirlwind few days since his suspension, a blur of phone calls, meetings, and late-night strategy sessions with the community leaders. The news of his suspension had spread quickly, sparking anger and frustration, but also a fierce resolve. The rally had come together almost overnight, a show of support for Jimmy and a demand for change. But standing here now, looking out at the crowd, he couldn't shake the feeling of uncertainty. Was this really going to make a difference, or was it just another moment that would fade, leaving everything exactly as it had been? He pushed the thoughts aside as Derek Williams, the youth mentor from the community center, stepped up to the microphone. Derek had been a key voice in organizing the rally, using his connections and influence to bring people together. Thank you all for being here today, Derek began, his voice clear and strong. We're here because we believe in something better. We're here because we know that change doesn't happen by waiting around. It happens when we stand up and demand it. There was a murmur of agreement from the crowd, a ripple of applause. Jimmy felt a flicker of hope, watching as people leaned in, listening intently. We all know why we're here, Derek continued. We've seen the way things are, the way we've been treated, and we're tired of it. We're tired of living in fear, of being judged, of being treated like criminals in our own homes. We deserve better than that. More applause, louder this time. Jimmy saw familiar faces in the crowd. Angela, Carla, even Tiana, standing with her mother, her small hand clutching a bright sign that read, "We trust Jimmy." His heart clenched at the sight, a mix of pride and responsibility. Derek gestured to Jimmy, his voice rising. Officer Fletcher has been trying to do things differently. He's been out here with us, listening, helping, making a real difference. And what did the department do? They suspended him because he dared to care, because he dared to do the right thing. The crowd erupted in shouts of anger and frustration. Jimmy felt his throat tighten. He didn't want this to be about him, didn't want to be the focus. This was bigger than that, bigger than him. I'm not here because I want to be a hero, Jimmy said, stepping up to the microphone, his voice carrying over the crowd. I'm here because I believe in this community. I believe in all of you, and I know we can make things better together. The crowd quieted, listening. Jimmy took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. I know the police haven't always been fair. I know we've made mistakes, that we've hurt people, and I'm sorry for that. I'm not here to make excuses or to defend what's been done. I'm here because I want to change it. He paused, looking out at the sea of faces, at the hope and anger and pain reflected back at him. But I can't do it alone. I need your help. I need your voices, your stories, your strength. We need to show them that we're not going to be silenced, that we're not going to let things go back to the way they were. There was a roar of approval, the sound filling the air. Jimmy felt a surge of energy, of determination. This was why he was here, why he'd taken this stand. Because these people deserved better, and he was going to fight for them, no matter what it took. We're demanding that the department reinstate Officer Fletcher, Derek said, his voice rising over the noise. But more than that, we're demanding change. Real, meaningful change. We want to see officers who care about this community, who are part of it, not just enforcers of the law. Jimmy stepped back as Reverend Green took the microphone, his deep voice booming over the crowd. This is about more than one officer. This is about all of us. About the way we're treated, the way we're seen. We're here today to say no more. No more fear, no more injustice. We're standing together, and we're not backing down. The crowd erupted into cheers, the sound echoing off the buildings around them. Jimmy felt a lump form in his throat. He looked around, at the faces in the crowd, at the signs and banners, at the people who had come out to stand with him, and he felt a deep, almost overwhelming sense of gratitude. He saw Angela and Tiana moving toward the front. Angela's face set with determination. She raised a hand, and the crowd quieted, turning to her. Jimmy felt a pang of worry. Angela wasn't the type to speak in front of a crowd, and he knew how hard this must be for her. "My name is Angela Roberts," she began, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "Some of you know me, some of you don't. But I want to tell you why I'm here today. I'm here because of my daughter, Tiana. Because she looked at a police officer and asked him if he was going to hurt her." There was a murmur of shock and anger from the crowd, and Angela nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "That's what we've come to expect, isn't it? That our children will grow up afraid, that they'll see the people who are supposed to protect them as a threat. But Officer Fletcher changed that for us. He showed us that it doesn't have to be that way." She glanced at Jimmy, her gaze steady. "He's been there for us, listening, helping, being part of this community. And I'm here today because I believe in what he's trying to do. Because I believe we deserve better, and I know he does too." The crowd erupted in applause, and Jimmy felt his throat tighten. He wanted to say something, to thank her, but he knew he couldn't find the words. All he could do was nod, his heart full. The rally went on for hours, speaker after speaker taking the stage, sharing their stories, their hopes, their demands. Jimmy stayed, listening, shaking hands, feeling the strength and resolve of the people around him. This wasn't just a protest, it was a movement, a call for change that went far beyond his own situation. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the crowd began to disperse. People drifting away in groups, still talking, still energized. Jimmy stayed, helping pack up chairs, collecting discarded signs, trying to process everything that had happened. Reverend Green approached him as the last few people were leaving, his face lined with exhaustion, but lit with a quiet satisfaction. "You did good today, Jimmy." Jimmy shook his head, a tired smile tugging at his lips. "We all did. This isn't about me." Green nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "No, but you're a part of it. A big part. Don't underestimate that." Jimmy sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I just hope it makes a difference. I hope it's enough." Green clapped him on the shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. "It's a start, and that's all we can ask for." Jimmy nodded, feeling the weight of the day settling over him. He was exhausted, but it was a good kind of exhaustion, the kind that came from knowing you'd done something that mattered. As he walked back to his car, the sky darkening around him, he felt a sense of resolve harden in his chest. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. There would be more battles to fight, more pushback, more challenges, but he wasn't alone. He had the community behind him, people who believed in him, who were willing to stand up and demand something better. And as long as they were willing to fight, so was he. He got into his car, the silence inside a stark contrast to the noise and energy of the rally. He sat there for a moment, staring out at the empty parking lot, his thoughts a tangled mess. He knew things wouldn't change overnight. He knew there were still battles to be fought, bridges to be built. But today, they'd taken a step, a small one, but a step nonetheless. And he was going to keep stepping, keep pushing, keep fighting. Because he believed in this community, in these people, and in the possibility of something better. As he started the car and drove away, his mind already racing with plans for what came next, he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to give up. Not now, not ever. Because they deserved better, and he was going to do everything in his power to make sure they got it. It was a crisp, clear morning as Jimmy Fletcher parked his car near the community center. The sun was just starting to rise, casting a warm, golden light over the neighborhood. He took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill his lungs, and stepped out of the car. Today was the day he was officially reinstated to the force. But more importantly, today was the day he'd start a new chapter in his work with the community. He'd been through it all in the past few weeks. His suspension, the rally, the media attention, the meetings with the department heads who had finally agreed to let him return under certain conditions. But he hadn't backed down, and neither had the community. They'd stood by him, supported him, and together they'd made their voices heard. The terms of his reinstatement were strict. He would be on a probationary period for 6 months under constant review, and any deviation from protocol would result in immediate dismissal. But they hadn't shut him down. They hadn't silenced him, and that was a victory in itself. As he approached the entrance to the center, he saw a familiar figure standing by the door, Angela Roberts, with Tiana by her side. Angela was smiling, and Tiana's face lit up when she saw him. "Hey there," Jimmy said, kneeling down to Tiana's level. "How's my favorite artist doing today?" Tiana giggled, holding up a piece of paper covered in colorful scribbles. "I made this for you," she said proudly. Jimmy took the drawing, his heart warming at the sight. It was a simple picture, stick figures of him, Angela, Tiana, and some other people he couldn't quite identify. But there was a big, bright sun in the corner and a rainbow arcing across the sky. It was hopeful, happy, and it made him smile. "Thank you, Tiana. This is amazing. I'm going to hang it up in my office." Tiana beamed, and Angela shook her head, laughing softly. "She's been talking about you nonstop, you know, telling everyone that Officer Jimmy is coming back." Jimmy's smile faltered slightly. "Yeah, well, I'm going to do my best to live up to that." Angela's expression turned serious, and she reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "You already have. Just keep doing what you're doing. We're with you." Jimmy nodded, feeling a surge of gratitude. "Thank you, Angela. That means a lot." They walked inside together, the familiar sounds of the community center welcoming them, the thud of basketballs in the gym, the chatter of kids playing, the low hum of conversation among the adults who had gathered for the morning's activities. It felt good to be back, like coming home after a long, hard journey. As they made their way to the main hall, Jimmy spotted Reverend Green talking to a group of parents near the stage. The Reverend looked up as they approached and smiled, his eyes warm and welcoming. "Officer Fletcher," Green said, extending a hand. "It's good to see you back." "Good to be back," Jimmy replied, shaking his hand. "Thanks for everything you've done, Reverend. I couldn't have gotten through this without you." Green's smile widened. "You've done plenty on your own, Jimmy. But we're just getting started, aren't we?" Jimmy nodded. "That's right. I'm ready to get to work." They spent the morning going over plans for the community outreach program they'd been developing, a series of events and workshops designed to build trust and understanding between the police and the neighborhood. It was ambitious, and Jimmy knew there would be challenges, but he was determined to make it work. As they wrapped up the meeting, Jimmy looked around the room, at the people who had come together to support this effort, and felt a sense of pride and hope that he hadn't felt in a long time. They were really doing this. They were making a difference. Afterward, he headed to the basketball court, where a group of teenagers were shooting hoops. He recognized a few of them from the community center, a mix of kids he'd met before, and new faces. They glanced over as he approached, their expressions a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "Hey, mind if I join you?" Jimmy asked, picking up a stray ball and spinning it on his finger. One of the boys, a lanky kid named Malik, shrugged. "Sure, if you think you can keep up, old man." Jimmy laughed, tossing the ball back to him. "I'll try not to embarrass myself too much." They played for a while, the game fast-paced and energetic. Jimmy felt the familiar burn in his muscles, the rush of adrenaline as he sprinted up and down the court. The kids were good, better than he'd expected, and they didn't hold back. But that was what he wanted. He wasn't there to be their superior, their authority figure. He was there to be part of the game, part of the team. After a particularly intense play, Malik jogged over, panting and grinning. "You're not bad, Officer Jimmy. You got some moves." Jimmy smiled, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Thanks. You're not too shabby yourself." Malik's expression turned serious for a moment. "So, you really back for good? Not just like playing nice for a few weeks?" Jimmy met his gaze, his voice steady. "I'm here for good. I'm not going anywhere." Malik nodded slowly, as if weighing the truth of his words. Then he shrugged, his grin returning. "All right, just don't expect us to go easy on you." "I wouldn't dream of it," Jimmy said, laughing. As the game wound down, Jimmy felt a tap on his shoulder and turned to see Derek Williams standing behind him, arms crossed, a small smile playing on his lips. "Not bad out there," Derek said. "You're almost keeping up with them." Jimmy chuckled, shaking his head. "I'm just trying to survive." Derek's smile faded, his expression turning thoughtful. "Seriously, though, it's good to see you back, man. We need more of this. More of you." Jimmy nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. "I'm going to do my best. We've got a lot of work to do." Derek nodded, his gaze steady. "Yeah, we do, but we're ready." They stood there for a moment, watching as the kids laughed and joked, the energy light and easy. Jimmy felt a sense of peace settle over him, a quiet certainty that they were on the right path. Later that afternoon, as he was getting ready to leave, he noticed a group of people gathered near the entrance, their voices raised in excitement. He made his way over, curious, and saw Captain Mitchell standing there, looking slightly out of place in his crisp uniform. The crowd parted as Jimmy approached, and Mitchell turned, his expression unreadable. "Captain," Jimmy said, surprised. "I didn't expect to see you here." Mitchell nodded, his eyes scanning the room. I thought I'd see for myself what all the fuss is about. Jimmy braced himself, expecting a reprimand or a lecture. But instead, Mitchell stepped forward, his gaze steady. I heard about the rally, Mitchell said, his voice low but firm. And I saw the petition. I know I've been hard on you, Fletcher, but I also know you're trying to do something good here. Jimmy felt a flicker of hope, but he kept his voice cautious. Yes, sir, I'm just trying to make things better. Mitchell nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly. I'm not going to pretend I agree with everything you're doing, but I can see that it means something to these people, that it's making a difference. Jimmy held his breath, waiting. So, Mitchell continued, his tone softening just a fraction, I'm willing to give you a little more leeway. If you keep things within reason, if you keep us in the loop, I'll support this outreach program of yours. Relief flooded through Jimmy, and he nodded, his voice steady. Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. Mitchell's gaze lingered on him for a moment. Then he nodded briskly. Just don't make me regret it. I won't, sir, Jimmy said. Mitchell turned to go, then paused, looking back over his shoulder. And Fletcher, good work. Jimmy felt a smile break across his face. Thank you, Captain. As Mitchell left, the crowd around him murmured with surprise and approval. Jimmy felt a swell of pride, a sense of validation. They were making progress, slowly but surely. Angela came up to him, her face alight with excitement. Did you hear that? He's backing you. Jimmy nodded, still a little stunned. Yeah, I heard. She laughed, a joyful sound that made him smile. This is just the beginning, Jimmy. We're going to change things, one step at a time. Jimmy looked around the center, at the people who had come together, who had fought for this moment, and felt a deep sense of gratitude and hope. Yeah, he said softly. One step at a time. As the day came to a close and the last of the people drifted away, Jimmy stood outside the community center, watching the sun set over the neighborhood. The sky was a brilliant canvas of reds and golds, and the air was cool and crisp, filled with the promise of something new. He knew there were still challenges ahead, still battles to be fought, but he wasn't alone. He had the community behind him, people who believed in him, who were willing to stand up and demand something better, and as long as they were willing to fight, so was he. He took a deep breath, letting it out slowly, and felt a sense of peace settle over him. This was what he'd been fighting for, what he'd been dreaming of, a chance to make a real difference, to be part of something bigger than himself, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. With a final lingering look at the community center, he turned and headed to his car, his steps steady, his heart light. He had a job to do, and he was ready to do it, because this was just the beginning, and he was ready for whatever came next.